So last time we really laid the groundwork, didn't we?
We absolutely did. We set up that whole fundamental conflict of
The
visions.
bedrock, yeah.
Yeah.
We went deep on the constrained view, the one that sees human nature as, fundamentally limited, and the unconstrained view, which believes we're malleable, improvable, that we can reason our way out of our problems.
And we kept stressing that these aren't just like political opinions. They are deep, often unspoken assumptions about how the world works, about causation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's so crucial to hang on to as we go into today's discussion.
It is, because the theory is the map. But today we're really hitting the terrain. We're taking those foundational ideas and applying them to the really explosive topics.
We're moving from the philosophy to the policy, right?
Precisely. From human nature to the nitty-gritty of law, economics, social policy. Our mission today is to see how these core visions shape the words that, we fight over every single day: equality, power, and justice.
What's so fascinating to me, and what the source material just lays out so clearly, is how this framework explains that weird consistency you see in politics.
You mean why someone's view on, say, military spending seems to predict their view on education policy?
Yeah, exactly. They seem totally unrelated on the surface, but this vision framework shows there's an underlying logic to it all.
There is.
Yeah.
And it's not arbitrary. If you start with that constrained premise that human knowledge is severely limited, you're naturally going to trust in systems that have evolved over time.
Things like free markets or tradition or a very rigid constitution with checks and balances.
Right. Decentralized processes. But if you start from the unconstrained view that human reason can conquer our flaws, then you're going to favor intentional, well-designed solutions.
And you'll want to put those solutions in the hands of the smartest, most moral people you can find.
Exactly. You'll concentrate power. So today's deep dive is really about tracing those two paths. We want to show how they start in the same place, wanting a good society, but end up with completely contradictory definitions of what a word like equality even means.
And just to be clear, our goal here isn't to say who's right or wrong.
Not at all. It's to expose the internal logic, to understand why the conflict is so persistent and, frankly, so difficult to resolve.
Okay, so we'll be looking at equality, then power and justice. And we'll finish up by digging into why these arguments just don't seem to go away.
Let's do it.
All right, let's jump right in with equality. I feel like this is where the rubber really meets the road. The core of so many modern debates seems to come down to this split between equality of process and equality of result.
It really is the first major battleground. And for the constrained vision, it's all about process. Full stop.
What does that mean in practice?
It means equal rights before the law, equal treatment under a consistent set of rules, and that's it. It doesn't matter what the outcome is. Edmund Burke, who's a classic constrained thinker, put it perfectly. He said, all men have equal rights, but not to equal things.
Not to equal things.
Yeah.
So the system's job is to ensure a fair race.
A fair start, yeah. Identical rules, no one gets a head start from the government, no favoritism, but they completely reject the idea that the system should guarantee everyone finishes at the same time. If the rules were applied fairly, then whatever inequality comes out at the end is, well, it's just an acceptable part of a free society.
And the reason they stop there goes right back to that core assumption about human limits, doesn't it?
It goes directly back. Thinkers like Hayek talk about what he calls irremediable inequalities. Basically things that are unavoidable because of, natural talent, luck, the sheer complexity of everything.
So trying to fix all of that would be impossible.
Worse than impossible. Hayek's argument is that human beings simply don't have the brain power, the intellectual or moral capacity to eliminate all those differences without just breaking everything. You'd need a level of centralized control and power that would destroy the very freedom and prosperity you were trying to spread.
So it's a statement about what's technically possible, not necessarily what's morally desirable.
I think that's a fair way to put it. It's a pragmatic argument.
Okay, but the unconstrained vision looks at that exact same argument, process only equality, and sees it as what? A cop-out.
A cop-out, or even something deeply cynical. They'd say, look, if one person starts the race 100 yards ahead and another is starting with their legs tied together just yelling, the rules are the same for everyone. Well, it's a joke. It's hypocritical.
This is where the focus shifts entirely to the results, to the actual conditions of people's lives.
Exactly. You see this with thinkers like Condorcet, way back in the 18th century. He argued for what he called a real equality, which meant society had a duty to mitigate even the natural differences between men.
Even the natural ones, so not just social disadvantages, but differences in, say, intelligence or talent.
That's the ideal, yeah. The belief is that if human reason is powerful enough, then even those outcomes can and should be managed, can be adjusted to create a more equal society.
And this is where we get those really powerful critiques of equal opportunity. The famous one that always comes to mind is George Bernard Shaw.
Oh, the pen and paper analogy, it's perfect.
Right. He said that giving his son a pen and a piece of paper and saying, there, now you have an equal opportunity to write plays like me, is just absurd.
It's absurd because it ignores everything that actually matters. The decades of experience, the connections, the reputation, the sheer, unarticulated skill that Shaw himself possesses.
So, for the unconstrained view, formal equality is just a way to lock in the advantages that already exist.
It is. It just reinforces the status quo. And this is the logic, that underpins all those policies designed to level the playing field, things like special education programs, affirmative action, wealth redistribution. They're all trying to equalize the chances of getting a good result, not just making sure the process is formally fair.
So that brings up a really important question. If the constrained view sees inequality as sort of an unfortunate but inevitable byproduct of freedom, how does the unconstrained vision explain where it comes from?
Well, they see it very differently. For them, inequality isn't an accident. It's almost always the result of someone actively exerting power or a system being deliberately designed to benefit one group over another. It's a form of harm.
So wealth isn't just created, it's taken.
In many cases, yes, that's the diagnosis. William Godwin argued that huge fortunes are built by taking from others the means of a happy and respectable existence. Shaw, again, said profit wasn't a reward for innovation, it was just overcharge.
The assumption there is that the pie is sort of fixed, and if someone has a huge slice, it must mean someone else's slice is smaller.
That's a big part of it. The idea is that society is already rich enough, and the problem is one of distribution, of the wealthy hoarding or taking what should be shared more broadly.
This idea of active harm seems really central. I'm thinking of Edward Bellamy's argument, which is just so powerful.
It's incredibly powerful. Bellamy didn't just see the poor as unfortunate, he saw them as being actively robbed.
Robbed of what, exactly?
Robbed of their rightful inheritance as co-heirs of all the prosperity that society has built up over generations. He argued that when society offers charity to the poor, it's not generosity. He called it adding insult to robbery.
Because you're just giving back a tiny piece of what was theirs by right in the first place.
Exactly. You're giving them crusts. It completely reframes the debate from an economic problem to a profound moral indictment. Poverty isn't your fault, it's the fault of a coercive system.
Okay, so let's contrast that with the constrained view again. They see inequality as a misfortune, something that's mitigated by good social processes, not caused by them.
Right. For someone like Milton Friedman, the free market isn't the cause of poverty. It's the most powerful engine for eliminating it that has ever existed.
His argument was always that the market's greatest benefit was for the common person, right?
Yes. Friedman would say, look, the rich were always rich. They had status and comfort in every system throughout history. The miracle of the free market was that it allowed the ordinary man to achieve a standard of living that was literally unimaginable before.
So from this perspective, the focus isn't on how the rich got so rich. It's on how the poor got so much less poor than they would have been otherwise.
Precisely. The market isn't seen as a system that creates inequality, but as a system that dramatically reduces the absolute poverty that would exist without it.
This all leads to a really interesting paradox that this source material points out, this tension around merit and elitism.
Yes, this is one of the most fascinating twists in the whole framework.
So let's unpack it. How can the unconstrained vision, which is all about fighting for the economic equality of the masses, at the same time imply a kind of profound intellectual and moral inequality?
Because the whole vision depends on articulated reason. If you believe society's problems can be solved by smart people sitting down and designing solutions, you have to answer the question, who are those smart people?
It's not the masses, because if they were capable of solving their own problems, they wouldn't be in this situation in the first place.
That's the logical conclusion. The masses are seen as currently trapped by poverty or prejudice or flawed ideologies. Therefore, the path forward must be designed and led by those who have cultivated superior reason and moral insight, the intellectual elite.
So people like Godwin or Shaw, while championing the common person, also kind of looked down on their current abilities.
They often did. They saw the elite, the cultivated minds, as being precursors to their fellows in the discovery of truth. They had to lead the way.
And you see this play out in the real world. The example of Gunnar Myrdal and his work on third world development is just striking.
It is. He literally called the peasant masses hopelessly backward, his words. And he argued that for these countries to develop, they needed the firm direction of the educated, westernized elite. He called them surrogate decision makers.
So the argument is, we need to create economic equality for the masses, but the decisions about how to do that must be made by a small, intellectually superior group. It's a kind of intellectual aristocracy in the service of economic democracy.
And that flows directly from the core unconstrained assumption that the articulated, concentrated reason of the few is better than the diffused, messy, unarticulated experience of the many.
But the constrained view has its own paradox, right? They defend a system that creates huge inequalities, but they don't actually argue that the winners deserve it on a moral level.
Not at all. This is a huge misconception about their position. Constrained thinkers almost never defend the existing distribution of wealth as being individually merited.
So they're not saying the rich are better people.
Yeah, absolutely not. Hayek openly admitted that in a market system, some unworthy will succeed and some worthy fail. And think about Adam Smith. He had a famously low opinion of businessmen. He called their motives mean rapacity.
So if the winners don't necessarily deserve their winnings, what's the justification for the whole system?
The justification is 100% systemic. It's not about the individual, it's about the process. The unequal rewards are just necessary signals and incentives that get the whole system to work. That process, in turn, produces freedom and a general prosperity that benefits everyone, even if the distribution isn't fair in a moral sense.
So the focus is on the integrity of the process, not the moral desert of the people who win or lose within it.
Exactly. It's a completely different way of justifying a social order.
This tension over who's capable of making decisions, the elite few or the decentralized many, that leads us right into the whole concept of power, doesn't it?
Directly. It shapes how you see power, what role it plays, and, crucially, where you think discretion should lie in a society.
In the unconstrained vision, it seems like power is the answer to everything. It's the key variable.
It's the primary explanation for social problems. The logic is, if humans aren't inherently flawed, then social evils like crime or poverty can't be natural. They must be the result of someone deliberately using their power badly, or some institution being prejudiced. They are inflicted, not inherent.
I'm thinking of that philosopher, Holbach, who claimed you could trace almost every crime back to bad laws or bad institutions.
That's the perfect example, and if you believe that, then the solution is obvious. You have to redirect power. You seize control of the institutions and use that power intentionally for good to fix the problems.
So if the constrained view doesn't believe that all these problems are caused intentionally, what's their explanation?
For them, power plays a much, much smaller role. Because human limitations are seen as massive and permanent, most social outcomes are systemic. They're the unintended consequences of millions of people interacting.
So from their point of view, things like crime and poverty aren't the big mystery.
Not at all. That's the default state of humanity. That's what happens without functioning social systems. The real mystery, the thing that needs explaining, is the opposite. How do we ever get peace and wealth?
And the answer, through these evolved social processes that coordinate everything.
Right. And those processes don't rely on people being good or having virtuous intentions. Adam Smith was clear that the baker doesn't give you bread out of the goodness of his heart. The system works by harnessing self-interest, not by trying to make everyone an angel.
This all boils down to the question of the locus of discretion. Who gets to decide?
Exactly. And the unconstrained view, as we saw with Myrtle, naturally wants to concentrate that discretion in the hands of the elite, the wisest and the best, who can supposedly see the big picture and design rational solutions.
Though that can lead to some odd places. Godwin took it to an extreme of individualism, right? Believing everyone would eventually become perfectly rational.
He did. He thought discretion could be widely diffused because eventually everyone would be wise. But most unconstrained thinkers aren't that utopian about the present. They see that we're not there yet, and so in the meantime, some kind of compulsion or direction from the top is needed.
Which brings us right back to those surrogate decision makers.
Right back to them. Myrtle thought you needed that social discipline because he just didn't trust that the general population could overcome their traditions on their own. The core belief is that centralized, articulated reason is the fastest path to the solution.
In the constrained view, they take the exact opposite approach.
The polar opposite. Their whole starting point is that crucial knowledge is tacit, it's practical, and it's spread out among millions of people.
Yeah.
So you can't concentrate it. You have to disperse discretion.
So in that vision, the government's only job is to maintain the framework, the laws, the markets.
maintain the rules of the game. And within that framework, individuals make their own choices using their own local knowledge. The system works through incentives like prices in a market that coordinate all that dispersed knowledge without anyone being in charge.
Adam Smith famously warned about the danger of giving any single person or council the power to direct the economy.
He said it was an authority that could be trusted to no single person, no council or senate, whatever. And for him, it wasn't just a power problem, it was fundamentally a knowledge problem. No central planner could possibly know enough to make better decisions than the millions of individuals on the ground.
And this clash between concentrated and dispersed discretion, it plays out so dramatically in the legal world. I'm thinking of the fight between judicial activism and judicial restraint.
Oh, it's the perfect legal manifestation of the entire conflict. Judicial activism is the unconstrained vision in a black robe.
So thinkers like Lawrence Tribe or Ronald Dworkin, they argued judges have to do more than just apply old rules.
Much more. They have to apply constitutional values, bring fresh moral insight to the table, and actively push society toward a better, more just outcome.
And for them, a judge who just passively applies the rules isn't being neutral.
No, they see that as a choice in itself. Tribe argued that if a judge refuses to rule on, say, how property rights reinforce an unjust distribution of wealth, that judge is implicitly endorsing the status quo. For them, so-called neutrality is a paralyzing seduction.
But the advocate for judicial restraint, the constrained side, sees that as a massive overreach of judicial power.
Completely. Their view is that a judge's job is to define the boundaries set by the law and apply the explicit rules. They are meant to be umpires, not players. Their role is to maintain the integrity of the process, not to aim for a particular social outcome.
Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. is the classic example here.
He's the archetype. Holmes believed the law wasn't some perfect system of moral logic. It was an evolved summary of our entire society's experience. He said once the law sets a boundary, you're free to go right up to the line. The court shouldn't second-guess your choices inside that line.
So the constrained jurist is more afraid of a judge having too much power than they are of an imperfect outcome that results from a fair process.
That's it, exactly. They fear the judge becoming a philosopher king more than anything else.
It's interesting how we can link these very abstract legal ideas back to something as concrete as third world development policy.
It's the same logic, just in a different field. We can circle right back to Myrtle, the unconstrained planner. He saw development as needing a huge overall plan, coordinated from the top by that westernized elite to drag the masses out of their traditions.
He believed power had to be concentrated to achieve the rational goal.
Yes. But then you have his counterpoint, P.T. Bauer, the constrained economist. Bauer rejected Myrtle's entire approach. He famously said the market delivers the goods people want, but those who make it work cannot readily explain why.
He celebrated the local knowledge and adaptability of ordinary people.
He did, and he had this incredibly sharp insight. He said that Myrtle's contempt for ordinary people and his hostility to the market were two sides of the same coin.
Because the market relies on the dispersed wisdom of the masses, while central planning requires you to believe the masses are, well, kind of dumb.
Precisely. So you end up with Myrtle wanting economic equality that results from concentrated political power, and Bauer wanting political equality dispersed discretion that results in economic inequality, because he believed that was the only path to real prosperity and freedom.
If the fight over power is that intense, then the fight over justice, I mean, that feels even more fundamental, almost spiritual.
It is, because again, we have this word that everyone thinks they agree on, justice, but it splits into two completely opposing functions depending on your vision.
For the unconstrained vision, justice is the ultimate goal, isn't it? The non-negotiable end result.
It's the absolute. John Rawls defined it as the first virtue of any society. And he said something crucial. Justice does not allow that the sacrifices imposed on a few are outweighed by the larger sum of advantages enjoyed by many.
So you can't trade justice for anything else, like efficiency or social stability.
No trade-offs allowed. And in this view, justice demands perfect individualization. Godwin said justice flows from the contemplation of each individual case, because no crimes were ever alike. The goal of the law, in a sense, is to try and see men as God sees them, to weigh every motive, every circumstance, to get a perfect result.
The constrained vision, though, seems to pull back from that completely. They see perfect individualized justice as, what, a dangerous fantasy?
A dangerous fantasy for a human court, yes. For them, justice is not the ultimate goal, it's an instrument. Its main job is to maintain a predictable, stable social order.
Adam Smith again. He thought we needed justice just to keep society from falling apart.
Right. He believed our self-interest is so powerful that society needs the rigid rules of justice to overawe us, to stop it from becoming a den of lions. So justice serves the needs of order. It's a tool, not a transcendent ideal.
This leads right into what the source calls the trade-off dilemma, and the example of William Blackstone. This is where the fixed rule of law crashes into the idea of equity or individual fairness.
And Blackstone's conclusion is just devastating for the unconstrained view. He admitted that law without equity, a rigid rule applied without mercy, can be hard. But, he said, it's much more desirable for the public good than equity without law.
Why is that? Why is a system of pure individualized fairness so dangerous in the constrained view?
Because if every judge just rules based on their own personal feeling of what's fair in that one case, you destroy all predictability. No one knows what the rules are. As Blackstone warned, it makes every judge a legislator, and the result is infinite confusion.
So the cost of trying to get a perfect outcome in every single case is the collapse of the entire legal system.
The collapse of social order itself, which is why the constrained view always prioritizes a stable process over a perfect result. It's why Holmes deliberately aimed for a lower standard of justice, one focused on deterrence, because he knew the higher standard was simply beyond human capability.
And trying to reach for something you can't grasp just makes things worse.
It destabilizes the whole system. And that's why the conflict becomes so existential when you start talking about social justice.
Right. For the unconstrained vision, social justice is everything. It's a non-negotiable right to specific results. A certain distribution of income, of opportunity. Back to Bellamy, the poor are owed these results.
But for F.A. Hayek, the constrained champion, the very phrase social justice is, well, he called it an absurdity, a mirage, even a quasi-religious superstition. And he didn't just think it was a silly idea. He thought the pursuit of it was profoundly dangerous.
Okay, we have to unpack his reasoning there. Why is it not just wrong, but destructive?
Hayek's logic is this. You can only call an action just or unjust if there's an intentional actor behind it. A person can act justly. But the outcome of a market economy is the result of millions of disconnected decisions. No single person intended the final distribution of wealth.
So judging the market's outcome as unjust is like judging a hurricane as unjust. It's a category error.
It's a category error. The outcome is amoral. It's just a systemic result. And Hayek warns, the moment you try to impose a specific just distribution, you have to create a political body with the power to decide who gets what.
And that concentration of power is what he fears.
That, he says, is the road to tyranny. It can destroy a civilization because it undermines the rule of law and replaces it with the arbitrary decisions of a planning board. The cost of chasing the mirage is freedom itself.
So these two different ideas about the function of justice naturally lead to two different ideas about what a right is.
It has to. In the constrained vision, rights are basically defensive. They're procedural areas of exemption from government power. Negative rights. The government's duty is not to interfere.
So Holmes saw free speech not as some sacred moral principle, but as something that was socially useful, and therefore could be limited if it caused a clear and present danger.
Exactly. And property rights exist to make the economic engine run smoothly, to create prosperity for everyone. It's about protecting the process.
But the unconstrained vision sees rights as moral entitlements to actual results. Positive rights, not just freedom from interference, but a claim on society's resources.
Lawrence Tribe's argument about free speech is the perfect illustration of this. He pointed out that back in the 1700s, speech was cheap. You just needed a soapbox. But today, effective speech requires access to expensive media.
So if I can't afford TV ads or a social media campaign, my right to free speech is meaningless. It's just a formal right, not a real one.
Yes, and that implies that maybe you have a right to have your communication subsidized, or even a right to access private property, like a TV station, to ensure what he calls equality of voice. It turns a negative right into a positive entitlement.
So the same word right leads to completely opposite policies. For one side, property rights are the foundation of freedom. For the other, they're the primary obstacle to justice.
And there you have the conflict in a nutshell.
As we move away from these specific applications, the big question that looms is, why? Why does this fight never end? I mean, in science, we had debates like phlogiston versus oxidation, and eventually one side won because of the evidence. Why doesn't that happen here?
That question gets us to a really crucial distinction. The difference between a social vision and a scientific paradigm.
Okay, break that down.
A vision, as we've been saying, is that pre-analytic cognitive act. It's your gut feeling about how the world works, your sense of causation. A paradigm, in the scientific sense, is the actual structured, testable theory that grows out of that vision.
And in science, paradigms can be broken by experiments.
Decisively,
Hmm.
a single set of controlled experiments showed that oxidation explained combustion better than phlogiston, and pretty soon, phlogiston was gone. But social visions persist because you can't run those kinds of experiments in society.
Right. We can't have a control group. We can't run a simulation of the 20th century without World War I to see what would have happened. The data is always messy.
It's impossibly messy. It's contaminated by a million other variables. And because the evidence is never conclusive, both the constrained and unconstrained visions can survive forever. Any fact that contradicts your vision can be explained away. You can say it was a temporary setback, or the policy wasn't implemented properly, or some other factor interfered.
So the visions become almost unfalsifiable. They're so complex and layered, they can absorb any contradictory evidence.
They become insulated from a direct collision with reality. And that leads us to what might be the single most important insight of this whole framework.
Which is?
The conflict is fundamentally about causation, not about competing moral values.
This is a huge point. You're saying that people on opposite sides of the political spectrum aren't arguing because one side is good and the other is evil.
For the most part, no. The source material is adamant that the conflict isn't driven by different value premises. People on both sides generally share the same high-level moral goals. Everyone wants to reduce poverty. Everyone wants a safe and stable society. Everyone wants to help the vulnerable.
So you're saying a hardcore libertarian capitalist is probably just as horrified by the existence of poverty as a revolutionary socialist?
Absolutely. Think about it historically. Adam Smith and William Godwin were contemporaries. They were both looking at the same 18th century Europe with its incredible poverty and entrenched aristocracy, and they were both morally appalled by it.
But their different assumptions about causation led them to prescribe opposite medicines for the same disease.
That's it perfectly. Smith, with his constrained vision, concluded that the only way to lift millions out of poverty was through the messy, imperfect, systemic process of the market, even if it created inequalities along the way.
While Godwin, with his unconstrained faith in human reason, demanded a radical redesign of society, especially property rights, which he saw as the cause of the suffering.
Their disagreement wasn't about whether suffering was bad. It was about what causes suffering and what are the real-world consequences of different policies. If you believe property rights exploit the poor, you attack them to help the poor. If you believe property rights are the only way to create the wealth that will ultimately help the poor, you defend them to help the poor. Same goal, opposite causal vision.
And this must be what explains those dramatic ideological conversions you see sometimes. People don't just wake up one morning and decide they don't care about justice anymore.
Exactly. When someone has a road to Damascus moment, like the communists who abandoned Marxism after seeing the reality of the Soviet Union, it's not because their moral compass suddenly flipped. It's because they were confronted with new information that completely shattered their vision of how the system actually works.
They realized the policies they thought would lead to utopia were actually leading to famine and totalitarianism.
The moral goal, a better world, stayed the same. But their belief about the causal link between the policy and the outcome collapsed.
And the source points out that we often use the phrase value premises as a way to avoid debating causation.
It's a way to shut down the argument. If I say, my support for a policy is just a value I hold, it's like saying I prefer vanilla ice cream. You can't argue with it. But if my position is actually based on a complex empirical belief about cause and effect, well, that's something we can and should debate with evidence and reason.
Okay, so finally, we have to address the elephant in the room. Special interests. Isn't this all just a fancy way of describing a fight between the rich and the poor?
The source is very clear on this, no. The visions themselves did not originate from class interest. Think of the key figures, Smith, Godwin, Hayek. None of them stood to gain personally in some obvious way. In fact, many advocates for radical equality were from privileged backgrounds and stood to lose status and wealth.
So the ideas are more fundamental than just one generation's self-interest.
Far more. They've lasted for centuries. But, and this is a big but, that doesn't mean special interests don't use them.
So the visions provide a ready-made intellectual framework to justify what you wanted to do anyway.
That's it, exactly. Once a logical template exists, like the constrained vision's defense of market processes, any business group that benefits from that can grab onto it to rationalize their position. And any group that wants radical change can grab the unconstrained critique of power to justify theirs. The special interests come and go, but the two underlying philosophical templates endure.
They provide the architecture for the conflict, even as the specific players change over time.
Yes. Let's try to synthesize all this. When you look at everything we've talked about today, from judicial philosophy to economic policy to the meaning of justice, the entire spectrum of our ideological fights seems to hinge on that one initial, often unstated assumption about human nature.
It all comes back to that.
It all comes back. Do you start from the premise that our limitations are inherent, they're permanent, and so our only choice is to manage them through messy trade-offs and evolved systems? That's the constrained path. Or do you start from the premise that our limitations are circumstantial, they're fixable, and we can achieve ideal solutions through the sheer force of our reason and will? That's the unconstrained path.
So the great clash isn't really over whether we all want things like justice or equality or freedom. Of course we do. The real fight is over what those words actually mean.
What they consist of, yes. Is equality a fair race or an equal finish?
And maybe even more importantly, what is our actual capacity as human beings to achieve these ideals directly?
Right. The constrained view looks at the attempt to create a perfect society and sees the road to tyranny. They see the perfect as the enemy of the good.
Whereas the unconstrained view looks at all the trade-offs and compromises of the constrained world and sees a morally bankrupt failure of will, a surrender to injustice.
If a better world is conceivable, they believe, we have a moral duty to try and build it, no matter the complexity or the cost.
So one side puts its faith in intentional design, guided by the wisdom of the best and brightest.
And the other puts its faith in systemic processes, guided by the accumulated unspoken experience of millions.
So this whole deep dive really asks you, the listener, to look past the surface-level labels, to stop seeing political opponents as just morally flawed, and to recognize that your own deepest beliefs are built on these silent assumptions about causation.
So maybe here's a final thought we can leave you with. Take a moment and think about the one political belief you hold most passionately.
Whatever it is.
Whatever it is. And try to trace its logic all the way back to its root. Does it depend on an assumption that human beings are fundamentally improvable, that social problems are solvable puzzles? Or does it depend on an assumption that we are inherently limited, and the best we can do is manage difficult trade-offs within a stable system?
What happens when you realize that the policy you support, with the best intentions in the world, rests on a view of human nature that, on reflection, you might not fully agree with? What if it's more utopian or maybe more cynical than you're comfortable with?
Which of your core beliefs is propped up by a causal assumption you've never really tested?
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the applications of the conflict of visions. We hope this framework gives you a new and maybe more constructive way to understand the arguments that are shaping our world.